Good evening, Rotarians and all the colleagues in peace. I'm Jim Holderman, the chair of the District 5450 Peace Committee, which is the sponsor of the Forum for Discussion. So we are very fortunate tonight to hear from, may I refer to you as Dr. Suzanne Ghais, an expert on conflict resolution and peace processes, without a doubt. She's a mediator, facilitator, instructor, and scholar with 3 decades of conflict resolution, including international, organizational, and environmental public policy issues. Skilled in helping groups with strong differences communicate constructively, reach agreements, and build productive relationships. Susan, our country needs you. Please hurry. So, as to move this process quicker, I'm going to stop talking, and Suzanne, the screen is yours.
All right. Thank you so much. And everybody, please do feel free to call me Suzanne. But thank you, Jim, for that really nice and background. And thank you for the invitation. I was so excited to discover this Rotary Peace Committee. So delighted to be with you here this evening. I'm going to share my screen. So the title of my talk is Prospects for Peace in Cameroon's Anglophone Crisis. And I'm speaking as a Rotarian. I'm a member of the Arvada Rotary Club. And I'm also, as one part of my work, executive director of Pathfinders for Peace, which was created, it's a 501c3 nonprofit created to work on this very little known conflict in Cameroon, although we're also open to working on other conflicts. So I'm going to start really with the basics. Where is Cameroon? I do get asked this often, so apologies if I'm speaking down to anybody. You already knew this, but you can see it there on the map on the left. It's just to the east and south of Nigeria. And although it's on the western coast of the African continent, it is considered a Central African country. So the image on the right shows the members of the Economic Community of Central African States, of which Cameroon is a member, and kind of probably the most prominent member, kind of the strongest country of that region, or at least it used to be. Arguably, it has slipped. So this conflict originates from, as so many conflicts do, from colonial history. So you'll see in the box on the far left there, in the purple, is the former German colony of Cameroon, with a K. Well, after World War I, Germany's colonies on the continent were distributed between the British and the French mostly. And so if you look at the third box, you'll see a blue area and a green area. So the blue area was the French Cameroon. So this was under a French protectorate after World War I. And the part that's in green is the British Cameroons, with an S at the end. So that part was under a British protectorate after World War I. Both achieved independence around 1960. It was the French portion first got independence. That was in 1960. And then the British portion, the actual British government and the UN did not give the option to the residents of British Southern Cameroons, of British Cameroons, to be completely independent. Instead, they were given only the options to either join French Cameroon or join Nigeria. And so you'll see in that far right square, the portion in yellow, the Northern Cameroons voted in a referendum to join Nigeria. And the part that's still in that fuchsia pink voted to join Cameroon. But again, they weren't given the option of outright independence, and that remains a grievance today. So a few key turning points. The moment of independence I've already described, except I'll add that Cameroon then became a 2-state federation. The west part was the former British portion, the east part was the former French portion. But almost from the get-go, the central government worked to try to assimilate the British side, to bring them into more of a unitary system. So they really never, even from the get-go, honored that federal system, even though it was written in the Constitution. In 1972, they held a referendum of the whole population of the French and British portions. And so, of course, the English speakers, those who had been under British rule, were vastly outnumbered. And through this referendum, the federal system was abolished, and the name of the country was changed from the Federal Republic of Cameroon to the United Republic of Cameroon. And ongoing efforts to kind of undermine the distinctness of the former British portion. Another key turning point there was in 1984, there was a constitutional amendment to change the name of the country to the Republic of Cameroon, which is the same name that just the French portion had before the British portion joined on. And over time, it wasn't just these symbolic things. The central government increasingly marginalized the English-speaking population, which they call the Anglophones. That's the French term for English speaker. There was less development effort and fewer development resources in the English-speaking areas, and less representation in that central government. And Cameroon actually has a very, very highly centralized government structure. So another way of understanding this is in the flags. So from independence until 1975, you see this flag on the left with the 2 stars representing the 2-state federation, just as our flag represents shows the 50 states with stars. And then on the right, it was changed to just that 1 star. So symbolically erasing that distinct group of people. Another map here, this shows the federal structure. I know this might be a little bit hard to see if you're on a small screen, but that little part on the sort of left of the screen says West Cameroon. That is the former British Southern Cameroons. And the other part is called East Cameroon. Later in 2008, there was a new set of, they call them regions. So rather than states or provinces, the portions of the country are called regions. And so there are 10 regions, and the Northwest and Southwest are the regions that were under British control. So I know it's confusing because I talked about Southern Cameroon's. What that means is the former British Southern Cameroon's, the southern part of the British portion. But in the terms of this more recent set of regions, it's called the Northwest and the Southwest. So to give a very, very broad summary of the viewpoints of the conflict parties here. One conflict party would be the English speakers or the Anglophones. And their grievances, as I've already alluded to, are having been marginalized, denied equal access to education, to justice, and to services, and also that they're just mistreated. They're talked down to, they're treated as second-class citizens, and often humiliated, even particularly by police and other authorities. And that's been really since the get-go. The other party to this conflict is really the central government. And their view is essentially that, okay, there may have been marginalization historically, but we have addressed that now. We have fixed it. And I'll describe this more later, but we held in 2019 a national dialogue on this problem, and we are currently implementing its recommendations, which include a special status for that Northwest and Southwest area that is the former British portion. So in 2016, there were mass peaceful protests by teachers and lawyers. Why those two groups? Well, because the central government was sending French-speaking teachers into the Anglophone regions, teachers who didn't speak a word of English. And similarly, they were sending French-speaking magistrates who didn't know the distinct legal system that had been shaped by the British model of the legal system. So both the education and the legal models were based on the British approach, rather, and the French-speaking central government was trying to force them to abandon that, basically. So there were these mass peaceful protests, and as happens in so many places, what changed that into a civil war was a violent response by the security forces. And then militias, violent militias began to form. And there had been already a small movement for independence of the former British areas. The name of the would-be country is called Ambazonia, and that's after the Amba Bay, which is there on the coast. So there was a declaration of independence of Ambazonia in 2017, and meanwhile, the violence was escalating essentially into a civil war. There were a number of leaders of this Ambazonia movement who initially were talking to the government, but that all went south and they went north to Nigeria. But the Nigerian government, and this was very controversial within Nigeria, the Nigerian government arrested them, imprisoned them, and sent them back to Cameroon, where those leaders remain in prison, in an awful, awful prison to this day. So this set of events was dubbed the Anglophone crisis, but it has been going on ever since. So we're at, 6 into the 7th year now. Of course, the leaders of this movement do not feel safe being in Cameroon, and that's, because the government has shown that it will imprison, lock up leaders of this movement. And so a lot of them have come to the United States and other countries, including Canada, numerous Western European countries, South Africa, and even some, farther away, Hong Kong and some other places. But the largest concentration is actually here in the US. So in a way, this is a conflict over legitimacy. So the Anglophones or English speakers argue that that rule by the French speakers, Francophones, is not legitimate because the Southern Cameroons was never given the option of independence. The government, of course, argues that the fighters for an independent Ambazonia, and they're known as the Amba Boys, that's a broad umbrella term, that they are not legitimate actors. They're criminals or they're terrorists. They've called them terrorists. And of course, they view themselves as the legitimate government. And so, none of this is allowed, this fighting by these Amba Boys, the various armed groups. Now, I know I have emphasized the grievances of the Anglophones, but since fighting has begun, there really have been horrible atrocities on both sides of this conflict. So as typically happens in civil wars or insurgencies, each side violently punishes those that are suspected of helping the other side. On the government side, as they search for Amba fighters, they tend to do it by burning a lot of homes to clear an area, and and terrorizing people by kind of shooting fairly indiscriminately, imprisoning people. People in prison get tortured, and there have been extrajudicial killings. The Amba Boys, initially as a form of nonviolent protest, closed schools, but this has continued. More than half the schools in the Anglophone areas remain closed. And they do some horrible things, like they punish teachers who try to continue with classes by cutting off their fingers so that they can't hold a piece of chalk. Others suspected of being government informants they have their hands cut off, or sometimes their arms cut off. There are lots and lots of kidnappings for ransom, because how are they funded? Well, the diaspora in the United States and elsewhere has funded them, but that flow of funds has slowed down. And so largely they raise funds through kidnappings for ransom. And they too have killed people suspected of being collaborators with the other side, with the government side. And last but not at all least, there has been pervasive sexual violence on all sides. Now, I want to offer a couple of caveats. First of all, this is not really an intercommunal conflict. That is to say, the grievances of the Anglophones are really not so much with the Francophone population. In fact, many of the displaced people from the conflict go to Yaoundé or Douala, the big cities in the French-speaking part of the country. And everyone pretty well gets along. The Francophones do have some prejudices and do some, have some not nice names for the Anglophones, but it's nothing really too serious. I also want to point out that the Francophones also have grievances against their government. It is the government of Paul Biya has been in place since 1982. He's the longest, I believe, the longest serving president in Africa. And even before he was president in 1982, he was prime minister for a few years. He's modified the Constitution to be able to get additional terms. There are elections, but they're seriously manipulated so that opposition candidates don't really have much of a chance. And then my final caveat is that I've depicted this as two sides, and that's got some truth to it, but actually there is a whole range of viewpoints, even among the Anglophones, the English speakers. Some of them support this idea of an independent Ambazonia, but some don't. Some want to go back to the federal system of two states, what the original Constitution said. And then other proposals have been put forward of a 4-state federation or a 10-state federation. And some, there are Anglophones, a few in the government, and they are loyal to the central state. So there's the whole range of opinion. So there have been many, well, not many, a few notable peacemaking efforts, and others besides have offered to mediate. So at one point, the Vatican did. At one point, there was some offer of help from the European Institute of Peace. There's also a Catholic NGO called Community of Sant Egidio, which does peacemaking work. They were actually the main mediators in Mozambique in the early 90s. So these are some of the groups that have offered to mediate an end to the conflict. So the one that initially seemed to make the most headway was known as the Swiss Initiative. And this was a partnership between the Swiss Foreign Ministry and the HD Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, which is a non-governmental organization based in Geneva. And Switzerland seemed to make sense because whenever Paul Biya gets sick, he goes to Switzerland for treatment, and he actually just spends a lot of time in Geneva. He occupies the top floor of a hotel. He's spent a lot of time there. So the Swiss, and needless to say, that all the things we know about the Swiss, being known as neutral and discreet and so forth. So they seem to be, to be well placed to mediate. So they sort of did a division of labor where the Swiss government was supposed to interface with the government of Cameroon, and the HD Center worked with the non-state actors. And so they did that. They had a big meeting in Switzerland in 2019 of many of the armed groups, but not all. They formed a coalition called the Ambazonia Coalition Team, and that still exists. But there had been a major split within the Ambazonia movement by that time, the independence movement. And the other group, which I think was probably larger, did not participate. They had some, it was hard to get a handle on why exactly they didn't want to participate, but a lot of it, there's been a lot of sort of competing for primacy of like who really represents this Ambazonia movement. So I think that was a big part of it. So the Swiss said that they had a mandate from the Cameroon government to do this mediation, but they were pressed by some of these Ambazonia groups to provide a written mandate, and they never could supply that. And meanwhile, the government of Cameroon just kind of dragged its feet, postponed and postponed. And meanwhile, they started planning their own national dialogue. So they really kind of left the Swiss hanging. So then in late 2019, the government very hurriedly put together this, what they called Major National Dialogue, or Grand Dialogue National. You might be able to see that in the background of the photo. This was led by the Prime Minister of Cameroon, who is an Anglophone, but the role of the Prime Minister is not as important in the Cameroon government as the title would make it sound. And it was done in a very rushed way. There was no real consultation as to the process and how it would work. It clearly happened in response to what was by that time a combination of international pressure and domestic pressure from civil society organizations to resolve this conflict peacefully. And although it was open to all, nobody was turned away at the door of this national dialogue, but they had no mechanism to ensure the safety of the leaders of the Ambazonia independence movement. And so, of course, they didn't participate. They didn't come. But it did produce a lot of recommendations, including this idea of a special status for the former British portion of the country. There's a very good piece written by the International Crisis Group arguing that, that's a significant step because there was no other formal structure prior to that since the federal arrangement that formally recognized that, hey, there's this part of the country that's distinct. So it might be something that could be built on, but the folks who favor an independent Ambazonia just regard it as a complete joke, like completely worse than useless. So once the Swiss initiative was finally called off, Canada stepped in to try to mediate. They called themselves facilitators, not mediators. So, theory being bit of a lighter touch. Canada had already helped to fund the Swiss process, so they were, working kind of hand in hand. And I have to say that there was a lot of wonderful advocacy from Canadians to help with this conflict. And there's a group in Canada that I talk to pretty regularly called Canadians for Peace and Justice in Cameroon. And there's a human rights project that's tracking atrocities. There's a database of atrocities in this conflict at the University of Toronto. So a lot of great work by a lot of great Canadians. And so Canada managed to host 3 meetings in the fall of 2022. They managed to get a delegation from both sides. So one delegation from the government, named by the government, but none of the members were actually government officials. And there was a fairly broad Ambazonia delegation. And they actually did, they not only talked about the process, but they actually reached some pretty substantive agreements on a temporary ceasefire, on humanitarian corridors, and on an exchange of prisoners, some prisoners. So at the end of this 3rd session, they agreed on a procedure to roll out, to make public the fact of these pre-talks and the agreement to move forward with more of a robust peace process. So on January 20th, the Canadian government announced that it had a mandate to facilitate a peace process. Those were the words they used. The next day, the Ambazonia delegation announced its participation in this Canadian peace process. 2 days later, the Cameroon government was supposed to announce, hey, we are participating in this too. That apparently was, reportedly, was what had been agreed to in the 3rd meeting in Canada. But instead, they put out a press release saying, we have not agreed to any facilitation or mediation. We have our national dialogue process, and that's what we're doing. None of this was authorized by us. So that was like, blew up the whole thing. It came really as a shock to those who had been working so hard at that. So my last visit there was about this time a year ago. My so I was recruited to work on this by a man named Ajume Wingo, who is a professor at University of Colorado Boulder. He teaches philosophy, actually, political philosophy. So he's the one who founded Pathfinders for Peace, and recruited me, as well as an Irishman named Porrick O'Malley, to work on this conflict. So Ajume and I traveled last year. We met with some high-level officials, including two from the security sector, one from the army and one from the gendarme, which, you know, the French model often has a gendarme. And we learned that part of the problem with the Canadian effort might have been that way they did the public rollout. The idea of hearing about it first from a foreign government, like from the Canadian government, rather than the Cameroonian government being able to announce it as, you know, as their own initiative or whatever, even though their delegation apparently had agreed to that. So, you know, there's some breakdown of communication somewhere. But we generally got the sense that there was some openness to negotiation to address this conflict. And we also learned, to our very pleasant surprise, that in recent months, maybe you know, the prior year or so, both sides seem to be taking more care not to do as much harm to civilians. So that was good news in terms of conflict management. So in terms of the prospects for peace moving forward, there's a theory well known in the peacemaking literature related to what's known as ripeness for negotiation. And one of the key theories is that if there is a hurting stalemate between the conflict parties, that means they're more likely to want to enter negotiations earnestly. And I think that probably exists. Neither side is winning. The level of violence has kind of gone up and down, but you know, I don't think either side can really claim like, you know, we've almost got this. One really hopeful thing that I've observed throughout is that the foreign actors who are interested in this conflict are kind of more or less in agreement that that a political solution is needed, that is to say, not a military solution, and that basically Cameroon needs to stay whole. So, in other words, no one is really supporting independence for this Ambazonia movement. Now, there's a huge unknown, which is that President Paul Biya is 91 years old. So you're not allowed to say this out loud in Cameroon, but he's not going to live forever. And so we're looking at a leadership transition, and how that happens, who ends up in charge, is a big unknown, and how much turmoil or even violence may accompany that. There is a provision in the Constitution for what should happen if the president dies while in office. It would temporarily go to the president of the Senate, but nobody seems to think that's likely to actually happen. I hope we don't see just a handoff to his son, which is what happened in Chad when the leader there died. But anyway, so that's a huge unknown. Our thinking currently is there probably needs to be some way to honor the national dialogue, even though the changes need to go a lot further than the recommendations that were produced by that. Maybe there's the occasion of the 4-year, I should say now 5 or 6 year anniversary of that dialogue could be an occasion to kind of critically re-examine it and use that as an occasion to go broader and deeper. Maybe that could be combined with negotiations that are separate or parallel in some way to it. And we also are very strong believers that in addressing a civil war, you've got to have civil society involved to express their views, because they're more kind of broadly representative of the population, but also so that you don't just reward those groups who took up arms. Civil society speaks for those who didn't do that and didn't support that. Lots of challenges all around. As I said, the government is extremely centralized and hierarchical. And so anytime you talk to somebody in the government, they just cite the party line, basically. You have to sort of read between the lines to understand what they actually think. There are rivalries. A key one here is the man there at the top, Ferdinand Ngongo. He is believed to be the person actually running the country, particularly when the president is ill, which he has been a lot. He may have dementia. So this guy on the upper right is really sort of the de facto person in charge. The man on the lower right, Joseph Dion-Ngute, is the prime minister, but as I said, really doesn't have much power. And there's rivalry between them. And so, if we could get some process that actually they both bought into, that would be amazing. But it's really difficult to know how to do that because, again, it's all about what comes down from the president. It's exceedingly centralized. On the side of the independence movement, there are countless groups. I borrowed this diagram from my colleague, Arcady Silverman. She is now actually working for the Canadian Global Affairs Canada, which is Canada's foreign ministry. But prior to that, she was a student and kind of one of the activists trying to get the Canadian government to get involved. So she did this wonderful diagram that shows these different so-called interim governments and all competing to lead this Ambazonia movement. And this is even out of date. Now there's an additional one, and some of these have formed different coalitions, and it's always kind of shape-shifting. And so the question is, how would you implement any ceasefire when the leadership, who are mostly based here in the US or elsewhere in the diaspora, has less and less command control over the fighters on the ground? They can't get their own act together, and a lot of the fighters on the ground have really just acted in a more autonomous way. So lastly, what's the role of the United States in all this? Well, first of all, it hasn't been all that much. I think that the United States largely defers to France because Cameroon is within, it's one of the former French colonies, and so it's within that French sphere of influence in Africa. And also, frankly, not much about Cameroon is really that high on the US policy agenda. One thing that is somewhat higher on the policy agenda is that in the far north of Cameroon, which is part of the Lake Chad Basin, that's part of the area where Boko Haram and other terrorist groups or extremist groups have been active. And so there has been some counterterrorism cooperation with the Cameroon government, but really the US hasn't had all that much active involvement in Cameroon. Now, we do have this huge diaspora in the United States, and they tend to go and meet with their members of Congress or their senators. So there have been some congressional resolutions, I think mostly in the Senate, if I remember correctly, calling for equal rights, calling for peace. None of them have called for independence, though, of the former British Southern Cameroons. There was not too long ago a case where some Cameroonian citizens in the United States, and these are Anglophones, were prosecuted and convicted actually for shipping weapons via Nigeria to the Amba fighters. So that was, they were held to account for that. And at one point, I think this is ongoing, but it was actually during the Trump administration that utilizing the Leahy laws, which prevent helping units of foreign militaries that commit gross human rights violations. So under that law, the US actually withheld some military aid to the Cameroonian military based on its human rights abuses. And finally, and this is a newer one, it was early in the Biden administration, the State Department announced visa restrictions on anyone who was a threat to peace. So that, potentially could be somebody from the government or somebody from the Ambazonia side. So I have to say, I have not always been a fan of US foreign policy. Don't even get me started on the Middle East, which was an earlier interest of mine since I am part Middle Eastern. But on this conflict, I think the US has actually been pretty good, pretty even-handed, pretty human rights oriented. But it just hasn't been very active. So what can we do? What could the US government do? And what could we as citizens maybe urge them to do? Right now, the French are really struggling in Africa. They've been kicked out of several countries since these coups happened in the Sahel. So maybe it's time that the US actually could take a more active role. I think the French are they're just very risk averse right now. I think that the US could support a new mediation effort or facilitation effort. There have been some calls for, African solutions to African problems. I put a big question mark there, though, because, one tricky thing is Paul Biya's age, and there's quite a strong norm across the continent to defer to your elders. And so the African regional organizations have not really done that much to press Paul Biya on any of this. But in any case, regardless of who the mediator is, and I don't really see the United States taking the lead role there, but the United States definitely could support a mediation effort, whoever leads it. I think also it would really be great if everyone could just raise awareness of this conflict. It is deadly. It does rise to the level of a civil war. It's been going on a long time. It's now hundreds of thousands of people that have been killed. Sorry, tens of thousands, but approaching 100,000, and many hundreds of thousands displaced by this conflict. So yeah, I know there are other things that are bigger headlines, and for good reasons. There are even much larger scale and more horrific conflicts going on. But I think one of the reasons that I think it would be a good thing to get more active on this one is I think this one might be at that point of ripeness, and we're actually with some, strong international urging and pressure and guidance, there actually could be a successful peace process on this conflict. I do think that the United States and others should continue to press both sides on human rights. And, what has held that back has been the cooperation with the Cameroon government in the far north of Cameroon over the violent extremism. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't insist on human rights. And so we at Pathfinders for Peace, we're a small group, not a lot of funding, but we have managed to do, we did some in-person events early on in this conflict and pre-pandemic. We have conducted educational events for the public, but also for the armed groups so that they come to kind of more of a realistic understanding of what they might be able to achieve and some better ideas of how they might approach peace negotiations. We have built trusting relationships on all sides. So the separatists, civil society groups who are not necessarily in favor of independence, and also on the government side. And we are actually working now on a plan to start delivering some training to initially folks in the diaspora, and hopefully others on skills for peace negotiations so that they can be prepared to engage in those productively when they finally happen. So that is about it. On the right here is my contact information, and I will be happy to display this again. I can be reached either here at sghais@pathfindersforpeace.org, which is my dedicated email for this work. But I also have my own mediation and facilitation business, and I have an email for that as well. So I welcome staying in touch. And with that, I'm going to stop the screen share. Okay. So Jim, how do you want to do this? You take the questions, or?
The question, that's just from the floor. I know that, I've got several.
All right. It looks like Gregory was trying to raise his hand. Is that okay, Jim?
Well,
certainly.
Great.
I mean, if you want to take stuff in the chat first.
Jump in, Gregory.
All right.
We're a small group. Go for it.
Isn't to what extent is Nigeria the big elephant that looks over all this? If they decided to participate, or is their interest in seeing the Anglophones um, get independence and maybe eventually unite with Nigeria?
So one of our board members is an expert on Nigeria, and we did have some early thoughts about recruiting Nigeria to lead like a contact group, a group of representatives of different countries to try to promote peaceful resolution here. What Nigeria's interests seem to be are, number one, not supporting an independence movement because Nigeria is its own house of cards. There is still an active Biafra separatist movement. And so they don't want to support a neighbor's separatist movement lest that neighbor support separatists within Nigeria. So they want to stay on good terms. The government of Nigeria wants to stay on good terms with the government of Cameroon. They have done, partnered to some extent in trying to tamp down violence along the border area between Nigeria and Cameroon. They are hosting a lot of refugees. So I don't think that they are, they're not hostile to the Anglophone population. They are hosting a lot of refugees from this conflict in Nigeria. But I don't think they don't really have any interest in trying to get, a new add-on to the state, to the Nigerian state, because, as I said, they don't want to rock that boat because they've got separatists of their own that they don't want to encourage. Yeah, good question. I wish we could get them more engaged in helping to address the conflict, but they too, like the French, are feeling like, yeah, kind of seems no win for them. So they're just kind of keeping a distance, trying to stay on good terms with the Cameroon government.
Peter, you've spent a lot of time on the other side of the border. Have you spent any time in Cameroon area?
I used to live in West Cameroon, the British-speaking part,
Oh,
and I was working with some of the local tribes there. And the question I have is, how has this conflict between the French and English speakers affected the local tribes
yeah.
in the former British area?
Yeah, yeah. So where did you live? I'm curious. Like
In Bamenda.
Bamenda. Yeah, that's really a huge hotspot. Well, around Bamenda, the urban area itself, I'm told, is now fairly secure. Good portions of it you can safely visit, I'm told. I haven't yet. So Ajume Wingo, who is the founder who recruited me to work on this conflict, he is actually a prince of the Nso kingdom, spelled N-S-O. You may have heard of that, Peter. And the fawn, these tribes, if you like, or kingdoms, are headed by what's called a fawn, F-O-N. And the fawn of Nso I've met twice now, lovely man. He just feels really kind of stuck in the middle of all of this. He doesn't really favor independence. He was at one point kidnapped by a separatist group and a gun held to his head. But he was released. So he has mostly been spending time away, but has gone back now recently. He's not sure if he can stay permanently. My understanding is that a lot of the other fawns and chiefs are of different, it's a mixed bag of opinions. Some of them do want independence, some of them don't. They're in a tough spot, They've lost, I think, some influence through this. It was so funny. I watched a short video clip that one of the separatist groups took when they kidnapped the fawn. And it was so funny to me because even while they had his hands tied behind his back, they were still calling him Your Highness, Your Majesty. This is very deep, the reverence that people have for their traditional leaders. So I think that they are just not happy about it. At least the Fawn is just distraught. He's distraught by this conflict, and I think he's lost influence as a result of it.
What is the population of the English in the French sector?
It's about 20% of the country is English speaking.
In Anglophone?
Yeah, about 5 million, a little under 5 million, I think.
I was intrigued by one of the lines on one of your slides. And by the way, phenomenal detail. This has been so enlightening.
Thank
But-
you.
But in one of your bullet points, and I don't know with the US or whatever, we're not going to give them military aid because of their human rights abuses. That seems like such an oxymoron. So if they didn't have any human rights abuses, we're going to give them guns. I'm sorry. I'm just being.
Yeah,
Just-
and I believe it was, I'd have to go back to those articles, but I believe it was specifically part of the Rapid Intervention Battalion, which interestingly enough is led by an Israeli, and were Israeli trained. So that's kind of like the special forces. So I believe it was a unit of that battalion that were sanctioned in this way. And I'm not actually sure if that's ongoing. But yeah, I mean, the US, we are purveyors of a lot of weaponry, and countries want them.
Would the world not be better if we'd stop handing guns to everybody in the world?
If you look at civil wars going on around the world, well, wars generally, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was kind of the exception that shattered the rule. But in war between countries has gone way, way down. But instead, what countries do is that they fund and arm their favorite side of internal conflicts, civil wars. And the research is very clear that this prolongs wars, except in the rare case where it actually helps one side win outright. But that's so rare. What it almost always does is prolong the war. And it's especially true when you have different countries arming opposing sides. So the Syrian civil war is a particularly tragic example where you had the Russians and the Iranians funding the government, and you had Western countries and some Arab countries funding the opposition. Same was true in Yemen. So when you get, all of this external aid, mostly it prolongs wars. Other questions or thoughts, reactions? I mean, Peter, I'd welcome your reactions, having lived in Bamenda, and
Unfortunately, my time in Cameroon was a long, long time ago, and I was there for 1 year in '65, and I had a close relationship with some of the Fons. I remember sitting together with them and drinking whiskey and stuff like that. I was studying Pidgin English of the local Pidgin.
yeah.
And I was really interested in anthropology, so I interacted with lots of the tribes like the Fulanis. And
Yeah.
so I've been keeping, as a side comment, unfortunately, I've been a witness to many, many of the trouble spots of the world. I've been in the Congo and the Congo Revolution. I've been in Iran and the Iranian Revolution. And so I don't even want to count all the trouble spots I've been in, because people think I must have been the CIA. But
Well, we
I
should
do have
get
fond
together
memories.
sometime.
I have fond memories, and I've traveled in French speaking, and I must say, of course, my heart was with the English speaking part of the country, and I'm horribly sorry as to see the recent developments, and with no solution in the near future.
Yeah.
But anyway, sometimes when you come to Mexico, you can visit.
Hey, I might take you up on that. Thank you.
I owe an apology to Vasante. I realized the US jumped ahead a few weeks ago, and I did not tell you. I did not change the dates on the time. Vasanti is
Oh,
joining.
for daylight savings time, yeah.
It's early Friday morning for her in India,
Oh, goodness. Well, welcome, Vasanti.
and I
Thank
apologize.
you. Thank you. Everything that Jim has been doing, I have found it very interesting, learned a lot, connected a lot. It's been an amazing experience. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bob, you have a question? You're on mute?
Yes, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, I mean, I'm sure the delicacies of working in a peace process like this. I mean, the idea of a process, you know, Africans working with Africans, having, is there, African Union seems to have, you know, is an organization that might be able to step in and
Yeah, they've built a lot of capacity to do conflict resolution. So I would love to see that. I just don't know why they haven't tried harder to step in, other than, you know, the reasons that I've already mentioned, like that deference to elders, and like the need for cooperation with Cameroon on counterterrorism in the Lake Chad Basin. And Cameroon is also hosting a lot of refugees from the Central African Republic, which is just to their east. So, I mean, I don't know. I would love to see it. I would definitely love to see the African Union take the lead. And sure, Western experts can come in. You know, peace processes these days are very much team efforts. You know, the idea of the one star mediator, like George Mitchell in Northern Ireland, it still happens sometimes, but they have a lot of helpers around and lots of, you know, ancillary players, like the Colombian peace negotiations, for example. I know lots of people who did some consulting or something that had something to do with that peace process, and there actually was not officially a mediator. The Colombian government didn't want one, but the governments of both Cuba and Norway played strong supporting roles. So I would argue that even if they might have not have like chaired the discussions, I think they had a strong influence from the sidelines. So, so circling back to your point of the African Union, they could appoint, you know, the panel of the wise, or one of them, or some neighboring, you know, former head of state or something, and then they could get all kinds of support from, well, from the UN and from, you know, experts from wherever. So I would love to see it.
Yeah.
Robert, you have a question?
It's so good, Suzanne, to learn about Pathfinders for Peace. Perhaps others on this evening are well acquainted. Are you
Probably not.
well,
Probably
and,
not. And I'll just
is
put the
the-
URL in the chat here too while we're, go ahead.
good? And is the concentration for Pathfinders for Peace on Cameroon at
Yes.
this time?
Yes,
And-
it is. And we were founded to address this conflict. I mean, basically,
Founded too. Yeah.
Ajume, when he recruited me, he was like, let's just do this work. We'll find some money somewhere. And, you know, he's just a very can-do person, which is wonderful. But as we raised money, we needed a place to put it. And so we created this nonprofit organization for this purpose, to focus on this conflict. But we defined our mission broadly. It is to help prevent and end armed conflicts by facilitating dialogue and negotiation. So potentially we could take on other conflicts. I sort of feel like we need some measure of success before we can credibly do that, however. We're not really there yet.
Well,
Not in-
our peace builders in various clubs will take note now of Pathfinders for Peace. Do you have some sense as to the number of emigres from Cameroon in our country, and where are the primary concentrations?
Washington, D.C., Maryland, that's the biggest area.
Oh.
And then they're scattered throughout as well, but I don't know the numbers. It's a lot. I mean, we held 2 events in 2019, one in DC and one in Boston. And, you know, standing room only. It was a lot of people. Yeah.
Very good. Wondering if you were working with those in the US
Yeah.
and as some avenue or some understanding. Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Are you connected to the Cameroonian community here?
No, just learning, and now alert.
Yeah. If you are interested in the issues of immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, some of them have been treated very badly. Some were forcibly repatriated by the US, just asylum claims rejected, and they were, sent back to face violence. Some have been detained in horrible conditions. NBC did a big expose on this a couple of years ago. Maybe it's improved. I've known some lawyers who have done volunteer work representing asylum seekers, and they've had, some have had success. There have been success stories and those who have achieved asylum status. But that's a lot of struggle.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And for what you do.
Well, Suzanne, this was fantastic. I had no clue, I had no idea, and this was tremendous. I'm wondering how much of this has repeated itself in many of the decolonization of the African continent. It's been an interesting decade, actually, of decolonization and challenges therein. A wonderful book I just completed talks about after the Roman Empire, it took 1,500 years before Europe finally decided governance and states. Hopefully, Africa won't take quite that long.
Yeah.
And hopefully, we allow them to discover their own rather than everybody jumping in and telling them how to do it.
Right.
Or at least, we can support, but let's not tell. Again, I thank you for a tremendous presentation. The slides were perfect. You're a very articulate lady, and so I am very pleased with that. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Jim, and see you all at a future forum for discussion.
See you all at a forum for discussion that will not occur. It will not occur in May. We're going to allow everybody time to go to the Rotary International Convention. However, in June, Rebecca Krall is going to talk about a phenomenal new program and a memorandum understanding between Rotary International and the Carter School for Peace at the George Mason University. In July, Summer Lewis will be talking about some very, very new exciting programs with IEP. So it's very exciting what Rotary is doing in the world of peace. And it's people like the Jim Roxlows and the Suzannes and every one of you on this screen that are so valuable to Al and Vasanti. I can't leave you or if for anybody else, Vasanti is also a peace activator, Rotary peace activator. So we're very honored to have all of you. And with that, I wish you peace for the rest of the evening.